Today we are going to discuss a very interesting model called yards with its modeler. So let's start our conversation by introducing you because other people may see this video. So can you briefly introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Emily Miner. I'm a professor at the University of Illinois Chicago. I'm an ecologist and I work mostly in urban landscapes.
Thank you. Now moving on, to our first question. Can you please explain the main purpose of this model and why did you create this?
Yeah, well, the model is about yards and gardens and residential landscapes and how people make decisions in those yards and gardens, and then the implications of those decisions for the ecosystem. And then over the last, I guess, decade, I've gotten really interested in residential neighborhoods and the yards and gardens because they can contain so many plant species. It's really surprising the high diversity of plants that they have. And those plants can provide good habitat for lots of species. So we've actually found some unexpected wildlife, particularly pollinators and birds, but other types of organisms as well, living in residential neighborhoods because of this high plant diversity and this potentially good habitat. So that's kind of what the model is about, the habitat that we can create in our yards and gardens. And through our field work in Chicago, and some other people have looked at this as well in other cities, we have observed these interesting spatial patterns in yards and gardens where yards that are close together tend to be more similar than yards that are far apart. It's called spatial autocorrelation. And we've seen this both in terms of we've seen this actually in a number of factors. One, in terms of the number of species in people's yards, so that if one house has a high number of plant species in their yard, then their neighbors are likely to also have a high number of plant species, or vice versa. They may all have low numbers of plant species. We've seen this pattern in vegetation structure, so like kind of the number of layers, if you have shrubs and trees, and the amount of vegetation. And we've seen it in species composition, so which species are actually present. And so, for example, we may tend to find yards where people have native plants kind of clustered near each other, where other sets of yards may just have mostly, say, shrubs, for example. So the purpose of the model is to try to understand these patterns that we've seen. I'd say there's probably two main purposes. One is to try to understand the causes of the spatial patterns, the spatial autocorrelation that we've seen. And we hypothesized that this is caused by social interactions among neighbors, and particularly something that we call mimicry. So the idea that people are mimicking each other's gardens. They see something in their neighbor's yard, maybe they like it, they want to copy it, or maybe it's even unintentional, something kind of subconscious, but they just want to fit in. So one purpose of the model is to try to see if we can recreate these spatial patterns that we've observed in the field. Can we create them just using some simple mimicry behaviors? And then the second purpose of the model is to more broadly understand the drivers and the consequences of biodiversity patterns in these landscapes. So, for example, it kind of seems intuitive to me that if people are copying each other's yards, if everyone wants to have the same plant species, then that may result in lower overall number of plant species or lower overall biodiversity in neighborhoods, if everyone, compared to neighborhoods where everyone has completely different plants. So it's possible that mimicry could be bad for biodiversity. And so that's something else that I want to use the model to explore.
Thank you. That's very interesting. And I'm curious about, are there any similar models like this, or if so, how do you compare this model with other similar models?
No, there's really nothing looking at yard diversity in this way. There are other models of residential neighborhoods,
Mhm.
but they're not looking at biodiversity of those neighborhoods. So this is the only one that I've encountered, at least, that looks at issues of biodiversity.
So, what kinds of challenges did you face during the development of this model, and you know, about the
Yeah,
conceptual components and I mean the modeling components of this model?
there's been a lot of challenges. This has been a really slow process, actually.
Mm.
I've been wanting to create this model for a very long time. I didn't have the skill set to do it, but it's kind of just been in my head that it was something that I thought would be really useful to do and really fun to do. So about 5 years ago, I started to try to teach myself to learn how to write code in NetLogo. And so, well, not just teaching myself, I participated in workshops. I took workshops by Steve Railsback and Volker Grimm. Right there, a really good book. And so that's where I started, just learning how to write the code. And so that was the first challenge, and I'm still working on that for sure. I'd say the second challenge is just thinking about how to represent this complex socio-ecological system in a simplified way. So what components of yards are important to try to replicate in the model and how to actually represent them. That is something that took a while to think about. And then I'd say the third challenge is really related to computational speed. This model is quite slow. It takes a while to run depending on the parameter sets. And so we've spent quite a bit of time trying to write more efficient code, but also trying to configure our computer so that we can get the model to run faster.
Interesting. So, did you have a specific, kind of research question at the beginning of the modeling process, or you found, your question during the development of the model?
No, I definitely had questions. The questions were really, what are the causes of this spatial autocorrelation? And I always kind of thought it was probably mimicry, but we had no evidence that that was what it is. So I wanted to know whether some simple behaviors, some simple social behaviors could create the spatial patterns that we'd seen. So that's the one of the questions. And then the other questions relate to biodiversity at different scales. So again, this idea that if people are copying each other's yards, does that mean they may have the same number of plant species in their yard as they would if they weren't copying their neighbors? But at a larger scale, if we look at the neighborhood or even the city scale, does that actually decrease biodiversity?
So now let's talk about the findings of this model, and I mean, what are the main insights coming out of the model analysis?
Yeah, so we haven't finished analyzing it yet. One, but it's something we're actively working on. I'm really hoping that we can get this finished and submitted as a manuscript this summer. One of the first things we've seen, and hopefully I can show you this with the actual model in a bit, but just by using some pretty simple mimicry behaviors, we can pretty easily reproduce the spatial patterns that we've seen on landscapes in terms of the number of plant species in people's yards. So just looking at whether people have lots of plant species or only a small number of plant species, just some simple mimicry behaviors can create pretty much the patterns that we've seen. But those mimicry behaviors alone don't create patterns in the species composition. So we may see that neighbors have the similar numbers of species, but they don't necessarily have the same species in their yards in the model if we only include the mimicry behaviors. Although in the field, we have seen that people's yard composition, the species they have, tends to be similar as well. So we introduced plant nurseries into the model as an additional social factor that may influence people's yards. And the plant nurseries, basically, they allow residents to pick plants from a limited number of plant species. Our full model has over 400 plant species, which is what we've observed in Chicago, but the nurseries have a smaller subset. And if people in the model get their plants from their local nursery, then that actually leads to spatial patterns in terms of the species composition as well. So by combining the mimicry behavior and then the plant nurseries, it seems like we were probably able to reproduce the patterns that we've seen in the field. So that kind of suggests that those may be the two main factors that are creating the patterns.
My last question about the ComSys.net and making models accessible to other peoples and researchers. So, how do you think about making models accessible to other researchers? And if did you face any challenges during the archiving your model on the ComSys.net? And if so, what types of challenges?
Well, I wanted to make sure that people could understand the model and could understand the purpose of the model. So I know that people who use COMSIS.net are from all kinds of disciplines, and so I think that was one big challenge, and I'm not sure if I succeeded, where I wanted to describe the model in a way, the purpose of the model in a way that would be clear to people who are not ecologists, people who are in different fields. So I worked pretty hard to try to make the code really clear, to try to write the model description in a really clear way, and to make the ODD really clear. Again, not totally sure if it is actually easily understandable to people outside the field, but that was my hope. So I'd say that was the biggest challenge, just trying to make the model accessible to people who are in different disciplines.
So, okay, thank you for joining me, and thank you for sharing your insights about this model.
Oh yeah, sure.